Engineers in California this morning are struggling to develop a plan to remove huge amounts of debris after a devastating landslide.
The ground moved last Tuesday, not the way California ground usually moves, that familiar, almost forgettable shimmy that residents shrug off between morning coffee and their commute. This was different. Along a 50-mile stretch of the Northern California coastline, monitoring instruments registered something that made seismologists stop mid-sentence and pull up their screens twice. Pressure readings deep beneath the ocean floor had spiked, not gradually, not over weeks, in a single, silent surge that instruments barely had time to capture before the numbers climbed again. Emergency geologists were dispatched within hours. Coastal engineers began running calculations they had hoped would never be necessary, and somewhere in a federal monitoring center, an alert quietly flagged a pattern that had been building, unnoticed, underreported, and catastrophically misunderstood for years. This is not a story about a distant threat. This is not a warning from a textbook or a projection from a computer model run by someone in a lab coat far removed from the Pacific shoreline. This is happening now. The California coast, a stretch of land that holds more than 39 million lives, more than $2 trillion in infrastructure, and centuries of American civilization pressed against the edge of a restless ocean, is under a kind of pressure that scientists are only now beginning to fully comprehend, and what they are finding has fundamentally changed the conversation about what the next great disaster will look like, when it will arrive, and whether anything can stop it. To understand why this moment is different, you have to understand what has quietly shifted beneath the surface of everything we thought we knew. For generations, the story California told itself about earthquakes was a San Andreas story. The fault line runs nearly 900 miles through the state, a geological scar visible from space, a boundary where the Pacific Plate and the North American Plate grind against each other with the slow, indifferent force of continents. Californians learned to name it the way you name a difficult neighbor. Familiarity did not breed contempt so much as a particular kind of resigned coexistence. Earthquake drills, retrofitted buildings, emergency kits beneath kitchen sinks. The San Andreas was the known devil. The threat had a shape, a name, a zip code, but geology does not respect the boundaries of a single fault line. And in the years since monitoring technology became sensitive enough to read the Earth's hidden pulse in real time, a more complex and deeply unsettling picture has emerged. The danger facing California is not simply the San Andreas waiting to slip. It is a system, an interconnected web of fault lines, subduction zones, pressure gradients, and oceanic forces that interact in ways scientists are still mapping. And the most significant pressure point in that system lies not beneath the sun-baked valleys or the famous freeways. It lies offshore, in cold water, in silence. The Cascadia subduction zone extends from Northern California all the way up through Oregon and Washington, running roughly 700 miles along the seafloor. Here, the Juan de Fuca Plate slides beneath the North American Plate at a rate of roughly 40 millimeters per year. That number sounds modest, patient, almost polite, but subduction zones do not release their energy continuously. They lock, they strain, they hold enormous quantities of accumulated stress across decades and centuries. And then they release it all at once in what geologists classify as a megathrust earthquake, an event of such magnitude that the very landscape reshapes itself in minutes. The last full rupture of the Cascadia subduction zone occurred in January of 1700. We know the date with eerie precision not from American records. There were none, but from Japanese coastal logs that documented an orphan tsunami. A wave that arrived without any earthquake, its Japanese observers could feel. The shaking had happened 4,000 miles away, across an ocean, and still the water came. Researchers have since found ghost forests along the Pacific Northwest coast, stands of trees that were swallowed by land subsidence during that rupture and preserved in tidal marshes, their silver trunks still standing 3 centuries later, like monuments to what the Earth is capable of. The question geologists have wrestled with ever since is deceptively simple and profoundly terrifying. How close is the next one? Recent data has made that question suddenly, uncomfortably urgent. In the past 18 months, a cluster of findings from multiple independent research teams has converged on conclusions that the scientific community is struggling to communicate without triggering panic. GPS sensors embedded along the coastline have detected subtle but measurable uplift and subsidence patterns inconsistent with routine tectonic drift. Seafloor pressure gauges, instruments deployed specifically to detect the kind of slow slip events that precede major ruptures, have logged anomalous readings at intervals that do not match historical baselines. And perhaps most significantly, a series of seismic tomography studies have revealed that a portion of the Cascadia Fault interface, previously believed to be creeping, releasing stress gradually and harmlessly, may in fact be partially locked, holding, accumulating. Slow slip events are themselves a relatively recent discovery in the field of seismology. They occur when locked sections of a fault interface begin to move in episodic, drawn-out pulses rather than sudden ruptures. They are too gradual to feel, too slow to trigger standard seismic alerts, but they transfer stress. They redistribute pressure along a fault system in ways that can prime adjacent lock sections for eventual failure. And in Cascadia, slow slip events have been occurring with increased frequency, a rhythm that some researchers now describe as a system approaching a threshold. The implications for California are not abstract. A full Cascadia rupture would not simply rattle windows in Seattle and Portland. The physics of a magnitude 9, nor or greater event propagating along 700 miles of locked fault would generate ground motion felt across the entire western coast, but the ground shaking, as devastating as it would be, is arguably not the most dangerous part of the story. The tsunami is. Water does not warn you. It does not announce itself with a long rolling rumble that precedes seismic shaking. After a major Cascadia rupture, the first indication many coastal residents might have would be the ocean drawing back. A strange, eerie recession of the shoreline as the wave gathers itself offshore. That withdrawal might last minutes. Some people, not knowing what it signals, would walk out onto the exposed seafloor to look at the stranded fish. They would not come back. The wave that followed the 1700 Cascadia rupture traveled across the Pacific in hours and still had enough energy to overtop Japanese seawalls and flood rice paddies miles inland. On the Pacific Northwest coast itself, indigenous oral histories describe walls of water that obliterated entire villages. The geologic record confirms it. Layers of tsunami sand deposited in coastal marshes show the reach and the depth of water that came ashore. Modern models of a comparable event project tsunami run up heights along portions of the northern California coast of 20 to 40 feet. In some low-lying areas, with the right combination of bathymetric focusing, the way underwater geography channels and amplifies incoming wave energy, projections reach significantly higher. The city of Crescent City, California, which has been struck by damaging tsunamis 4 separate times in the past century due to its unusual coastal geometry, sits directly in the projected impact zone. Emergency planners there have spent years working on vertical evacuation plans. The timelines they are working with, the window between a Cascadia rupture and wave arrival, is estimated at 15 to 20 minutes for the nearest coastal communities. 15 minutes. That is the margin. Not hours, not days. 15 minutes to move an entire coastal population to high ground, in the dark if it happens at night, after potentially severe ground shaking has damaged roads, knocked out power, and disabled communications infrastructure. The conversation about preparedness along the California coast is one of the most uncomfortable in American public policy. Not because officials are ignorant of the risk. They are not. The Oregon Resilience Plan, the California Geological Survey's hazard assessments, the Federal Emergency Management Agency's Cascadia Rising exercises, the documentation is extensive, rigorous, and deeply sobering. The discomfort comes from the gap between what the risk assessments say and what has actually been built, funded, and implemented. A significant portion of California's critical coastal infrastructure, water treatment facilities, hospitals, transportation corridors, communications networks, sits in projected high-hazard zones. Bridge retrofitting programs have made real progress in some regions and stalled in others due to funding limitations. Vertical evacuation structures, concrete towers built specifically to give coastal residents somewhere to go when the ground becomes ocean, exist in a handful of Pacific Northwest communities and virtually nowhere along the Northern California coast. The United States Geological Survey maintains that California's overall seismic risk management has improved substantially since the 1994 Northridge earthquake, and the building code reforms it triggered. That is true. Newer buildings perform better. Retrofit programs have strengthened older vulnerable structures. Early warning systems, the Shake Alert network, can now send alerts to cell phones seconds before major shaking arrives, providing enough time to drop, cover, and hold on. But seconds of warning for shaking is a fundamentally different challenge than 15 minutes of warning for a tsunami wave arriving in the pre-dawn hours after a magnitude 9. Rupture has already destroyed the infrastructure people would rely on to evacuate. The pressure surge readings that triggered last week's emergency geologist dispatch have not been fully analyzed. Official statements from state agencies have been cautious and carefully worded, language that acknowledges anomalous instrument readings without specifying what those readings might indicate. That kind of careful institutional communication is appropriate. Science requires analysis before conclusion. Preliminary readings are not predictions, but the researchers who study this system, who have spent careers reading the deep grammar of tectonic behavior, who understand what locked faults look like before they move, who have walked the ghost forests and read the tsunami sand layers, speak in different tones when the cameras are off. Not panic, something more precise and more unsettling than panic. Something closer to the focused attention of people who have been watching a particular clock for a very long time and have recently noticed the hands are moving faster. The Cascadia subduction zone has ruptured before. It will rupture again. That is not a hypothesis. It is among the most well-established certainties in Pacific Northwest geology. The question that remains open, the question that keeps the instruments running and the monitoring networks funded and the emergency managers rehearsing their scenarios, is not whether, but when. And beneath that question, quieter and harder to answer, another one, when the moment comes, will the people living along this coastline know what it means, know what to do, and have somewhere to go? The ocean is patient. It has been pressing against this continent for millions of years. It does not hurry. It does not slow down. And somewhere beneath the cold green water off the Northern California coast, in the dark where instruments strain to listen, and the earth keeps its own counsel, the pressure is building. The question is not whether it will break. The question is what we will have built, and what we will have left unbuilt when it does.